Hello and welcome to the Spoken Word. My name is Travis. I'm your host. And today we're going to be actually wrapping up the book of Genesis. So we have completed the backstory of the Bible in Genesis 1 through 11. We've met the fathers, if you will, of the nation of Israel. We've met Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, of course, has his name changed by God to Israel. So that's where the people of Israel or the Israelites get their name from. And now we are moving on into a new era that I'm calling the era of enslavement. And this will begin with one of the sons of Jacob actually being sold off into slavery in Egypt by his own brothers. And then ultimately his family will come down to Egypt. And then at a point in the future, their descendants will become slaves in Egypt. So let's talk about the story of Joseph and how these Israelites, these descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, get to the land of Egypt. So today we're going to be in the final chapters of Genesis, from Genesis 37 all the way through Genesis 50. And I will try to condense the story as much as I can. There is a lot of richness that's here. It's probably one of the most well-known stories of the Bible of all time. In fact, back in the early 2000s, the story was even made into an animated film by DreamWorks. So Joseph is one of the sons of Rachel, who, if you listen to our previous episode, you'll know was Jacob's favorite wife. So Joseph is really special to his father. Joseph has one brother named Benjamin, and Joseph is the older of these two sons. Jacob, of course, has 12 sons in total. He has 10 other sons besides these two, but Joseph is the clear favorite. The story in Genesis 37 mentions that Jacob gave Joseph a special robe that was made of many colors, so it was very ornate. It was a sign from his brother's perspective of their father's favor towards him. So his brothers really don't get along with Joseph very well. Joseph also has a couple of dreams where essentially the interpretation is that he's going to have some kind of power in the future over his brothers and over his family ultimately. So they resent him even more for this. So we have some really bad blood that's developing between Joseph and his other siblings. So the story progresses on, and Joseph is sent by his father out to go check on his brothers when they are tending flocks away from their father's camp. And when they see him coming, they decide amongst themselves, we're going to put an end to this and we're going to kill the boy. So one of the brothers, Reuben, sticks up for Joseph and says, well, let's not kill him. Let's just chuck him over here into one of these cisterns, which is like a well, essentially. It was a storage place for water. And Reuben intended to come back later and haul Joseph out and bring him back to his father. So they do this. They take Joseph and they strip him of his cloak and they chuck him in the cistern, and they take Joseph's cloak and they dip it in the blood of a goat to make it look like Joseph had been killed by some kind of wild animal. But the brothers don't stop there. Reuben actually never gets his opportunity to save Joseph because they see some traders who are going by and they are heading to Egypt. And so his brothers say, he's our brother after all, so we probably shouldn't leave him out here to kill him. Let's just send him off into slavery with these guys. So Joseph is sold by his own brothers to these merchants that are traveling to Egypt. Well, on the home front, the brothers return back to their father. They present the coat to him, and there's blood on it, and Jacob is just broken. He believes that his favorite son has been torn to shreds by some kind of wild animal, and he doesn't have a clue that his son is alive. And he just has very, very deep grief over this. But Joseph, as it would turn out, is alive and well and on his way to Egypt from the land of Canaan. Once Joseph arrives in Egypt, he is purchased by one of the officials of Egypt. He's higher up in the political structure of Pharaoh's employ. So Pharaoh being a name for the kings of Egypt. So this man is named Potiphar. So Potiphar is one of Pharaoh's officials, and now he has purchased Joseph to be a servant in his household. Well, Joseph excels at pretty much everything that Potiphar puts him in command of. And Potiphar essentially places Joseph over everything in his house, with the exception of his wife, of course. So Joseph is held in very high esteem by this official of Egypt. So Joseph is actually doing pretty well. But despite his faithfulness, Joseph runs into some problems. Potiphar's wife takes a liking to this young Hebrew, and she urges him to come to bed with her. Joseph refuses her repeatedly, but at one point, things come to a head, and she grabs Joseph and says, "Come to bed with me," once again. And he wriggles out of his own robe and goes running off out of the house. She turns on Joseph and accuses him of attempted rape. And she says, "Look, here's the evidence. I have his robe right here. I screamed and he ran off without his cloak on." So of course Potiphar comes home, and who's he going to believe? Is he going to believe the random Hebrew slave that he bought on the market, or is he going to believe his wife? So Potiphar believes his wife and has Joseph cast into one of Pharaoh's dungeons. Time goes on, and while Joseph is in the dungeon, he meets two other gentlemen, and one is a cupbearer of Pharaoh, and one is a baker. And the story goes that these two guys were in Pharaoh's employ, and they dissatisfied Pharaoh somehow, and so he has his cupbearer chucked into the prison, and he has this baker thrown into the prison as well. Now, for reference, a cupbearer isn't exactly someone who just stood around and passed a drink to the king. This guy would have been a pretty high official in the world of the ancient Near East, because this man would have had to be one of the most trusted people in your kingdom, because your cupbearer is the guy who, for one, is going to test whether or not the thing you're getting ready to drink is going to poison you. So you definitely don't want that guy able to be bought out, sold, or anything else. So you have the cupbearer, and then you have the baker. Well, both of these guys have a dream, and you remember that I had mentioned that Joseph had these dreams when he was a young man, and these are kind of a plot line for Joseph. He has his own dreams, and then we see that these two gentlemen have their dreams. And they're just baffled by what they experience in their dreams, and they're kind of troubled about them. So Joseph asks them, "Hey, what's going on?" And they tell them that they've had these dreams, and they don't know what to do about them. They don't know what they mean. And Joseph tells them, "Well, tell me your dream, because I can't interpret them, but I know the God who can." And so they tell Joseph their dreams, and God does provide Joseph with the interpretations. He tells the cupbearer that Pharaoh is going to restore him to his position, and he tells the baker that Pharaoh is going to have him executed. And shortly thereafter, things happen just as Joseph had predicted, as given by the interpretation from God. Joseph requests that the cupbearer remember him, and when Pharaoh restores him to his position, to tell Pharaoh what's going on. So the cupbearer is restored to position, and you would think that this is when things are going to get good for Joseph, but they don't, because the cupbearer kind of forgets about him and never mentions him. So Joseph is left all alone in the dungeon. Well, more time goes by, and eventually Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh is troubled by this, and he calls all of his officials, and none of them can interpret the dream for him. And then the cupbearer goes, "Oh yeah, hey, by the way, Pharaoh, I remember this Hebrew guy that was with me in prison, and we told him some dreams, and things happened just as he said, so maybe you should go ask him." So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, and he tells his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph does give an interpretation. Again, saying that I can't interpret dreams, but God knows everything, and he's able to interpret them. So Joseph gives Pharaoh the interpretation for his dreams. And the interpretation, in short, is that there's going to be a period of bounty in Egypt when there's going to be a lot of produce that's made, and there will be a time of surplus. And then following that, there will be a time of famine. So Joseph advises Pharaoh to put someone in charge of taking the excess from the times of plenty and storing away grain and supplies for the coming famine. So Pharaoh does this, but he doesn't just pick some other random Egyptian. He actually picks Joseph to be the one in charge of this. And Pharaoh elevates him to be the second in command in the land of Egypt. It was a position called a grand vizier. So Joseph, who was hated by his brothers, sold into slavery in Egypt, unjustly accused of attempted rape, thrown in prison, forgotten by the cupbearer, and now God has elevated him to the position of grand vizier. So this is where Joseph is at now. So he's a man of power, of influence. Pharaoh also procures a wife for Joseph from one of the priests of Egypt. So Joseph is now brought into the elites of Egypt, not only by his position with Pharaoh, but also now by marriage. So Joseph is doing great in the land of Egypt, and he does build storehouses and puts all the grain away and things like that that he had advised Pharaoh to do. So those are the times of plenty. Things are going great. Joseph is in charge. Then the famine comes, and the famine doesn't just hit Egypt, it even hits the land of Canaan where his family is still living. So like many people in the area that are experiencing this famine, they figure out that Egypt has supplies. And so people start coming to Egypt to get grain so that they can survive. So ultimately, Joseph's brothers, the same guys that chucked him in the cistern and then sold him off to Egypt years prior, those guys come to Egypt. And who do you think they meet? They meet Joseph. But Joseph is, of course, dressed in the garb and attire of a Egyptian. And to hide his identity from his brothers, he actually speaks to them through a translator, even though he can certainly understand what they're saying. So he kind of pulls this ruse of being a Egyptian through and through and not being who he actually is. So Joseph treats them kindly, and he does toy with them a little bit, though, because he accuses them of being spies, and he holds back one of his brothers as a prisoner there for a certain amount of time, saying that I want you guys to go back and bring your littlest brother, Benjamin, with you because I want to see him, and that'll prove to me that you're not spies, because Benjamin wasn't with them on this trip because Jacob had only Benjamin left as the son of his deceased favorite wife. So they are pretty torn up about this, but they get their grain and everything and head back to their father. And his dad, Jacob, is basically like, what are you guys doing to me? First of all, I lose Joseph, and now I have this other son that's stuck there and waylaid in Egypt, and now you want to tell me that you want to take Benjamin there as well? He's like, no, can't do. So time goes on. They eventually run out of grain, and they decide that they need to go back to Egypt. But they tell their father, hey, the Grand Vizier guy that's there, he said that he wouldn't see us again unless we had our brother Benjamin with us. So finally, Jacob does let them take Benjamin with them, along with gifts from the land of Canaan. So they head back to Egypt, and this time Joseph ends up revealing himself to his brothers. He treats them kindly. They're afraid that he's going to take vengeance upon them, and he doesn't. He forgives them. He cares for them. He supplies them with grain and everything else. Pharaoh learns that Joseph's brothers have come, and he actually tells Joseph, hey, you know what would be great? Why don't you tell your brothers to go back, get their families, get your dad, and bring everyone here to Egypt to live with us. So they are going back to the land of Canaan. They bring the grain. They grab Jacob and the whole household, and they bring the whole household of Jacob to the land of Egypt. Joseph secures some land for them in the area of Goshen. So they have their own little suburb, if you will, in the land of Egypt now. And things are going well. And Jacob sees Joseph. He is able to bless some of Joseph's sons, named Manasseh and Ephraim, who were sons that were born to Joseph in Egypt. And Jacob ultimately passes away there in the land of Egypt. So now you have the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, who are here in Egypt. They have some level of prestige thanks to Joseph. And it is here that the history gets a little bit more foggy, because this ends the book of Genesis. But if you flip to the next book, the book of Exodus, you'll find that the political situation has changed very much, and that there's a Pharaoh who has come to power who doesn't know a thing about Joseph. So things have changed a lot. So in the next episode, we'll discuss a little bit of that shadowy time in between, and try to bring up some of the archaeology that has been done to piece together this time between the end of Genesis and the beginning of the narrative of Exodus. But this concludes the story of Genesis. So we've seen the very beginning of the entire universe. We've seen the origin of the brokenness of the universe and the brokenness of humanity and everything else around us. We've seen divine judgment in the form of the flood and in the form of Sodom and Gomorrah. We have seen God choose, for reasons only known to himself, a small group of people to somehow bless the world and maybe bring forth this crusher of the serpent ultimately. And we've seen God be faithful to these people, oftentimes in spite of themselves. And even here in the life of Joseph, he summarized what had happened in this way. He told his brothers that what you intended for evil, God intended for good, so that many lives would be saved. So that is the story of Joseph, and that is the story of how the people of Israel, this small family, get to the land of Egypt and set up for this time of sojourning, or of being resident aliens in a foreign land for 400 years, as God stated to Abraham. So they aren't slaves at this point, but they are now in that foreign land, and we had the promise that they would be enslaved. So we will try to piece together how that happened in the historical record in our next episode, and then we will proceed on to Exodus. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.